In 1971, I was in graduate school, and I got an assignment from the woman who would be my thesis advisor, and she said to us, I want you to choose a subject that is not in the history books, that doesn't appear in the history of American art. So I decided I would choose an African-American artist. Because back in 1971, you could pick up any book on American art and you would not find a single African-American artist. I chose Jacob Lawrence. And she said, well, Jacob Lawrence, that's a good choice. She said, but there's this other artist named Romare Bearden, and he's on exhibit. There's an exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art, a retrospective, and I think you should go visit it. And she handed me the catalog that you see up on the screen right now. It's called The Prevalence of Ritual. I opened up that catalog and immediately fell in love. Because what I saw were these beautiful images of the black people at work, doing their daily chores, going to church, being baptized, and I thought, I've got to go see this work. Now, as it turns out, August Wilson, the very famous playwright, also saw that very same catalog. Somebody handed him that catalog. He opened it up, and he says it inspired him to write his 10 plays, which become the cycle of plays that made him famous. And in talking about what inspired him, he said, what I saw was black life presented on its own terms, with all its richness and fullness in a language made attendant to everyday life, ennobled it, affirmed its value, and exalted its presence. And what Wilson saw in that catalog is images of black women represented as monarchs. He saw everyday experiences like a Palm Sunday processional represented metaphorically based on a Byzantine processional from the 6th century. He displayed an unabashed love and celebration of the black female body. And he also displayed an incredible complexity in his work. And here's what I have to say about that complexity. And I'm going to read a passage from the book. This collage is called The Evening Meal of Prophet Peterson. And it looks large, right? It's actually about the size of this paper, actually. So you imagine the collage. So it's even more dense than it looks up here on this screen. The setting Bearden has constructed, like a hastily assembled puzzle, is a clash of incongruities. On the left, a black and white news clipping of a white man in a business suit is plastered to the wall. On the right wall is what looks like a yearbook photograph of a young black woman. A white Santa grins cheerfully from a television screen. Bearden has made use of a snippet of a reproduction of a painting, a formal chandelier, to define its improbable presence as a light fixture in the down at the heels interior. He represents the food of the meal as magazine clippings and the jarring combination of white woman, black woman, African artifact, television image, photos of a suited white man and young black woman, snippets of painting, all jammed into a cramped space, create the explosiveness of cultural collision. Who was this artist who could assemble so many disparate elements in his work into a unified visual text? It was clear that in anchoring his vision in black culture, he was also making a larger statement about culture in general. And so I wanted to know more about Romare Bearden. I wanted to know the story of his life, what motivated him, how did he come to collage, how did he come to this subject matter? But I was also looking for that larger story about culture in general. So I divided the book into 3 sections. The first section was Terms of the Debate. The second section is the Negro Artist's Dilemma, and I use that term very deliberately because that was his term, the Negro Artist's Dilemma. And the third section is the prevalence of ritual. That was sort of the finale of his life, the last 20 years of his career. So I start with the Terms of the Debate, and I start with his childhood. Romare Bearden was born in the South. He was born in Charlotte, North Carolina in 1911. Moved up north, migrated with his parents, migrated north with millions of other African Americans, migrated to Harlem. He spent most of his time in New York. He traveled to other cities as well, but most of his time in New York City. And he died towards the end of the 20th century in 1988. So his life spans the 20th century. And in fact, if we think about his grandparents and his great-grandparents, his life goes back to slavery. This is Bearden in his little dress and shoes and little socks. This is Henry Kennedy, who is his great-grandfather, and his great-grandmother, Rosa. They were emancipated slaves. His grandmother, Catherine, was born in 1863, the year of emancipation. They are a very prosperous family. They are part of a tiny fraction of African Americans who, during Reconstruction, were able to gain land. He worked for the railroad. He bought property. They're very prosperous. And everything in this photograph documents that. His tie, his watch chain, their beautifully tailored clothes, the hairstyles, everything. Because this was an era when constructing visual images was a possibility for Black people in a way it had not been when they were slaves. And Black people took advantage of that. Photography became a huge activity to author themselves and to say, this is who I am. But at the same time, and this is what I say about this photograph, at the same time, others in the culture were looking at African Americans and representing them much differently from the way they were representing themselves. And this is what I have to say about that photograph. Mundane as the photograph might seem, it was a vital record of the family's status at a time when visual images were fast asserting power and influence. Their photograph captures a successful post-Reconstruction Black family that had hoisted themselves up from slavery and were filling their homes with successive generations of Black citizens, contributing members to Charlotte's thriving economy. Just as the Kennedys and others were enjoying the fruits of their new entitlements, there was a backlash turn-of-the-century vitriol that fueled verbal and written debates about the millions of newly enfranchised Black citizens. The increasing use of lithographs, wood engravings, and etchings, as well as photography, enabled the wide circulation of cruel and demeaning parodies and satires of everything families like the Kennedys were striving to achieve. In the years after slavery, pictures of Sambos, lusty bucks, buffoonish coons, solicitous grinning mammies, and as Bearden himself would write as an adult, head in the watermelon caricatures proliferated. Bearden's family had much to lose or gain from the debate. Advertisements for everyday products, sheet music theater, the new medium of moving pictures and photographs, especially the macabre practice of photographing the lynching of Black citizens, attempted to reduce the industriousness of families like the Kennedys and the Beardens to allegories of sloth or worse, a threat to the moral order. American visual politics was a battlefield, and representation was a matter of life and death, not just art. And that's pretty much the thesis of the book, that Bearden grew up at a time when we literally have and had and still have to a great extent in this country, warring visual images, warring representations. The cartoon you're looking at on your left is by Thomas Nast, who usually was very sympathetic to African Americans, but in this case is making fun of their ability, or in this case inability, to conduct themselves as elected legislators. It continues. This is a photograph of Bearden now, 6 years old. You can see his little, here he is, smiling. His great-grandfather, his great-grandmother, his grandmother, his mother, Bessie Bearden, and his father, Howard Bearden, and his aunt. Beautiful photograph of the family. And right next to it is a very popular Currier and Ives print that was in circulation at the same time. These were very popular because, in fact, this is the way mainstream media wanted to represent African Americans. And it wasn't just in prints and photographs and lithographs, and these were very often published in popular magazines that had wide circulations. It was also evident in movies. The first blockbuster that this country had was Birth of a Nation. It was circulated in 1915. 5 million people in the United States saw it, including the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, who praised the movie. If many of you had seen Spike Lee's Black Klansman, you know that he alludes to the really vicious and bestial images that were in Birth of a Nation. So from the very moment that cinema becomes popular, the subject matter is the degradation of African Americans. But really the most awful of the visual imagery in this country was the habit and practice of photographing lynching. It's bad enough that there was lynching. They were put on postcards. They were mounted in storefronts. During the lynching, the photographs were taken, they were developed and circulated. As you can see, large audiences came to these. So this notion of creating these images was actually vicious, widespread, and overwhelming. Bearden had an advantage, however. And his advantage was that when his family moved up to Harlem, they moved to a neighborhood, to a community that itself was creating visual images that were quite the contrary to the mainstream images that would have been circulating. So this photograph is taken in 1917, and it's the silent parade that took place to protest many of the riots that took place at the end of World War I. It was organized by James Weldon Johnson, W.B. Du Bois, and a number of leading other African-American leaders. 10,000 African Americans marched down Fifth Avenue in New York City, silently. The women dressed in white, the men dressed in dark suits, and the only sound was the sound of muffled drums and the signs that they held in protest. And this is what I write about that in the book. In shades of black and white, the impeccably dressed marchers moved slowly and silently down Fifth Avenue, as if in a slow motion film, unspooling an epic narrative of racial and civic injustice. The silent protest foreshadowed the kind of public visual spectacle in Harlem that captivated Bearden as a child and contributed to the densely rich culture that was the foundation of his work. And so the other argument that I make in the book is that, yes, there were all these negative images that surrounded him, but he also came from a culture that was itself producing this incredibly rich visual culture. The parades were one of them. The parades could be a protest, but they could also be the parades of Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association. They could be the parades of the Elks or the Masons. They could be funeral processions. But these were beautifully choreographed pageants that took place on the streets of Harlem. It wasn't only the parades, film. There was a very robust Black filmmaking tradition not only in Harlem, but in other urban areas. And in fact, you can see from this that Bessie Bearden, Bearden's mother, was in one of Oscar Michaud's early films. We've lost the film. We don't know where the film is, but we do have the playbill. The Lafayette Theater was right around the street from where Bearden lived. So going to the movies, he would have seen, he could have seen some of the racist films that were there, but he was probably more likely to see many of the films that were created by African-American filmmakers. And then, of course, there was his mother, Bessie Bearden. Bessie Bearden was one of the central political, social figures in Harlem. She was a correspondent for the Chicago Defender. She held political office. At the time of her death, she was deputy tax collector. She had been chairman of the school board, the first woman and the first black person to be chair of her school board. She held a salon in her apartment, and people like Du Bois and Garvey and Duke Ellington and Fats Waller and Langston Hughes were there in her apartment. So Bearden was surrounded by these incredible thinkers and musicians and artists. So he was, growing up, he was surrounded with just an amazingly rich culture. By the time Bearden was a young man getting ready to go to college, actually the Depression hit, the crash, 1929. But his family was able to send him to college. His mother had a full-time job. His father worked for the city of New York. And the first college he attended was Lincoln. Now his mother thought her beautiful child should be a doctor. And she would tell everybody that he was going to go off to college to be a doctor. But as you can see from his first year at Lincoln, here he is a cartoonist, H.R. Bearden. He had other plans. Now, Bearden went to a total of 3 colleges. He went to Lincoln for a year. He left Lincoln, went to Boston University, and played varsity baseball there. He actually almost had a professional career. He was scouted, in fact. But the scouts wanted him to pass for white in order to play baseball, because in those days, they weren't taking any, it wasn't until Jackie Robinson, right? And he absolutely refused. He left Boston and finally went to New York University and spent his last 2 years in college at NYU and graduated in 1935. So he graduates, it's still in the heart of the Depression, and he's, again, his mother thinking that he could possibly be a doctor, probably didn't know that if she had looked at his transcript, mostly what he was taking was art courses. So he had already decided in his mind that he was on his way to being an artist. And he had, again, the good fortune to decide to become an artist at a time when there were some of the most phenomenal artists of the 1930s actively at work in Harlem, right in his neighborhood. Now, before I talk about these artists, I just want to put out a fact that astounds me every time I say it. Bearden graduates from college, right? He has to make a living. So he gets a job as a caseworker for New York City. That's a heavy job. He's got to go around from apartment to determine who's eligible for relief. It was called relief in those days. Relief, and it's a full-time job. So he emerges as an artist while he has a full-time job, and he kept that job until 1966. And so this notion of him going out to work, you know how tired you are when you come home from work? Going out to work, coming back, changing into his studio clothes, and then starting to paint astounds me when you look at the body of his work. So just keep that in mind till 1966. But he had surrounded, in Harlem during the 1930s, he was surrounded by true masters. This is Aaron Douglas. Aaron Douglas is truly one of our great masters, American masters. And this actually is a very large painting. There are 4 panels of them, and it's called Aspects of Negro Life. And Douglass was a mentor and an advisor and to Bearden, and really someone he was older than Bearden, who really helped give him a sense of what it could be like to be a professional artist. The other person who was extraordinary was Augusta Savage. Somebody needs to write a beautiful, wonderful book about Augusta Savage. She had a studio in Harlem. She opened it up to Norman Lewis, to Romare Bearden, to Jacob Lawrence. They could come in and she would teach them. They had to maybe do some chores, sweep the floors, clean the toilets or what have you. But she was there, right there, to help them also understand what it was to be a professional artist. And then Bearden had his peer, Jacob Lawrence. Jacob Lawrence was the same age, actually a little bit younger than Bearden. And Lawrence, in the 30s and 40s, actually was the artist who was gaining national reputation. Not Bearden at that time, but Jacob Lawrence. And Bearden said he would go into Jacob Lawrence's studio and he would watch him, and he could just paint so fast. It's like he knew exactly what he wanted to get on the canvas, and he would paint it with nonstop. Bearden didn't have that facility at that time, but Lawrence just seemed to have that capacity. And this is from his great series, the Migration series, with half of which is in the Museum of Modern Art and the other half at the Phillips Gallery. But the other aspect of Bearden's visual education was Harlem at night. Harlem in the 30s was still a great cabaret scene. And I love this. This is a cartoon by E. Sims Campbell. It was done in 1932. And the image here is of a jammed packed place with cabarets and big theaters and juke joints and places for rent parties, and that's exactly how it was. Bearden said they used to call themselves, he used to get with a group of other artists, they used to call themselves the Dawn Patrol, because they'd go out at about 10 o'clock and they'd stay out all night, and they would have access to some of the greatest musicians and artists of our time. So in addition to the nightclubs, there was also theater, and I just want to show this is the Lafayette Theater for the opening of Macbeth. And if you see the exhibition, the beautiful Bearden exhibition, you'll see that Bearden recreated a playbill from the opening of Macbeth. But in the 1930s, Orson Welles directed what's called a Voodoo Macbeth at the Lafayette Theater. So they had, so just think of it. They had film, they had theater, they had the nightclubs. Here's the Cotton Club, Cab Calloway and his Corrines. So he had this just very rich, not only visual education that he continues to get, but also the artistry and something that was a little bit transgressive as well. This is Gladys Bentley, who was a male impersonator. And as Bearden said, she liked to sing songs with naughty lyrics. And he loved that. He loved that. That was as much, for him, that was as much a part of his education as anything else. Although, at the time, he didn't realize it. At the time, he kind of associated this nightlife with play. It was only when it'd be years later when he realized what he had been seeing and the level of performance and the level of artistry and mastery that he was witnessing in those years. Of course, speaking of transgressive, there was Josephine Baker, who took her act to Paris and, in fact, inspired artists like Henri Matisse. So we've learned recently, just recently, there was a scholar who just did her dissertation at Columbia on the French artists and the black model in French art, and discovered letters of Henri Matisse that tell us that Matisse was in Harlem during this era going to see those very same cabaret shows. And so we can see how much they influenced his art as well. So surrounded by all of that, it's not a surprise that Bearden, when he writes his first essay, he writes The Negro Artist in Modern Art, and he is what they used to call a race man, totally immersed in his race, totally celebrating it, and he writes in his first essay, if it is the race question, the social struggle, or whatever else needs expression, it is to that the artist must surrender himself, an intense, eager devotion to present everyday life, to study it, to help relieve it. This is the calling of the Negro artist. So he was passionate about that, and he remains passionate about that. When he first starts producing art on a regular basis, which is as a cartoonist. This is one of his cartoons from the Baltimore Afro-American. It is not only about black issues, but it's a protest. He spares nothing. The Ku Klux Klan is equated with fascism and Nazism, and he does that on several of his cartoons to demonstrate that terrorism, domestic terrorism being equal to fascism. When he turns to painting, which he does towards the end of the 1930s, he takes as his subject matter the conditions of black people during the Depression and represents them. His first show is in 1941, and these are all illustrations from the paintings that were shown in his show. He shows a woman clearly impoverished in the top image. In the middle, factory workers, and down below, two women in a courtyard. So the idea for him is to represent black life. Fortune magazine publishes one of his paintings of unemployed workers for an article that they're doing in 1942 on unemployment, on the failure of the New Deal to really give equitable attention to African American workers. So this becomes what Bearden is known for. He is a race man concerned about the condition of his country, the inequities that exist. And then he goes into the Army, right? He enlists. And it's the first time the Army is segregated, right? Of course, during World War II, Army segregated. He had never quite experienced segregation in quite that way. He hated it. He had a terrible time in the Army. He could not get used to the severe divisions, what he called the absurd inequities. During that time, his mother dies very suddenly. During that time, there's a huge riot in Harlem, and so conditions start to deteriorate in Harlem. Many members of his community start to move out of Harlem. Aaron Douglas came to Nashville, to Fisk. Jacob Lawrence moved to Brooklyn. And so his sense of community of the artist dissipates, and he begins to rethink who he is as an artist. And he begins to interrogate what it means for him to be an artist, and therefore what subject matter he should be attaching himself to. And in the second part of the book, that's what I explore, the Negro artist dilemma. That's the phrase that he uses. And he means by that the Negro artist dilemma, it's a title of an essay that he wrote. What he says to himself is that, you know, if I use that label Negro artist, it confines me. It reduces me to other people's expectations. And during this time, he even writes to Hale Woodruff, who's doing the Atlanta Annuals, and say, I'm not going to send any more work to the Atlanta Annuals because I don't want to be categorized as a Negro artist. And he boycotts for a while African-American shows, and his artwork changes completely. He eliminates African-American subject matter. This is the first series that he does in his new sort of abstract mode. It's called He Is Arisen. It's a series of Passion of Christ series. He begins to look at European art and begins to base many of his compositions on European art. He writes this essay, The Negro Artist's Dilemma, and he talks about the privilege of the oppressor to depict the oppressed. And he literally proclaims he is not primarily a Negro artist, but an artist. And for the next 20 years, from the time he's in the army, for 20 years till 1964, he does abstract painting, overwhelmingly. Publicly exhibits it. Not privately. We now know that he was still clinging to the image privately, but publicly he exhibits abstractions. And it worked for him. And by that I mean he got picked up by a New York City gallery. He got reviewed by art critics. And then 3 years after the gallery picked him up, they dropped him. So now he has no New York gallery. He's disassociated himself, right, from a community of black artists. And he decides, one of his friends says, you gotta get out of here. You need to go to Paris. So he takes his GI Bill and he enrolls in the Sorbonne, because you had to be enrolled in a school to get your benefits, right? So he takes his GI Bill and he goes to Paris in the early 1950s. And he says on his application that he's working on his PhD. But in fact, as he said, he went to very few classes. And but he had a ball. For him, Paris was the perfect place. He went over there, he heard James Baldwin read his novel. He met Al Murray, who was a brilliant writer who would become a lifelong friend. He would run into jazz musicians. He got to go to the studios of Picasso, Brancusi, and Leger. He felt a huge burden had been lifted off of him. He could be an artist and not have to think about race. The problem is he didn't do any painting. He came back to the United States truly longing and trying very hard to raise money to get back to Paris, and takes up songwriting. Still not painting very much. He's going to write some songs and get some money and go back to Paris. And he's kind of successful during the songwriting. Still has his full-time job with the city, and then has a nervous breakdown. And the way he describes it, he was walking down the street and he said, I couldn't go any further. And so I sat down and wrapped my arms around a fire hydrant. And he was hospitalized at Bellevue. And that time is not exactly certain. It was one of the things that I could never nail down. I tried to get the records from Bellevue. They claimed they couldn't get their hands on them. We just couldn't nail it down, but we know that it's sometime in the 1950s. It's the Cold War. Artists really are isolated. It's a difficult time for him. There's no community of black artists in the 1950s. He's still in Harlem. He still has his studio is above the Apollo Theater. You can see him walking down the street with the Apollo in his background. And he during this period continues to hold a studio in his studio. This is 1954. He tries to gather some artists together and try to create a sense of community, but it's not really working for him. He does some sketches from the nude, but he can't really get himself back into painting until he meets this young woman who's Nanette Rohan. Nanette Rohan was a model, a dancer. She was in some commercials, like the Vaseline commercial and the Colgate commercial. She was on television. And she, in their relationship, she recognized right away that he shouldn't be songwriting, that he wasn't really serious about his art. And she really made him turn his focus back to his painting. And in the years between the time they were married, between 1954 and 1959, he made his way back to painting and made his way back to abstract painting. This is a painting from that period. She actually helped him get his first New York show. He hadn't had a show since the 1940s. She helped him get his first show. He got a new dealer, a man by the name of Arne Ekstrom, and he began to do these wonderful big abstract oils that once again became very popular with New York art critics. And so he was kind of back in the good graces of the New York art world. And these paintings are truly extraordinary. There was a show at the Neuberger Museum of all of his abstract work. They're very large, very lush, beautiful surfaces. And he could have painted like this all of his life and been a reasonably successful artist doing that. This is President John F. Kennedy. And the painting behind him on the wall is a painting by Romare Bearden. When Kennedy had his pre-inaugural suite in New York City, Bearden's was the only painting that by an American artist that was included. And of course, it was the only painting by a black artist. So once again, he had, quote, he had made it. But one of the things that's quite wonderful is he is a restless artist, and he's an artist that stays very much in tune with the world around him. And the world around him was changing because the civil rights movement was rapidly coming to the fore. If he turned on his television set, he would see the sit-ins of the students at the lunch counters. He would have known about the freedom rides. And finally, he gets a call from A. Philip Randolph, who tells him, we're going to do this March on Washington in 1963, and we think the artists have to be part of this. Now, in the meantime, Bearden is experimenting with collages. That's one of the experiments. And one of his friends, a playwright, does a play, produces a play on the Brown versus Board of Education, the challenge to segregated schools that led to Brown versus Board of Education. And the name of the play was A Land Beyond the River, and this collage was Bearden's gift to that playwright. So we know that as early as 1957, he was beginning to think of these collages that are going to become his landmark work. And that takes us to the prevalence of ritual and back to the painting, the collage that we saw earlier. So in 1964, the Congress on Racial Equality was doing a fundraiser, and they came to Bearden and they said, can we have a piece of your work for an auction? And so this is what he gave them. Now, he had never exhibited these collages publicly, but he thought that for a core, he would give them this work, and he gave them. This is the first time anything like this by Bearden had been seen publicly. And even as he was doing the big oils, he kept working on these in his studio. And by this time, he had organized a group of black artists called Spiral. It was Hale Woodruff, Norman Lewis, Charles Alston. There was one woman, Emma Amos. And they were beginning to meet, and they were thinking that maybe they'd go to the March on Washington together as a group. And he's doing these collages, and one member of Spiral says, and again, it's a very small piece. That piece is like this, right? So one of the Spiral members said, you know what, you ought to photograph that in black and white and blow it up. So that's what Bearden does. And this projection is about that size. And Bearden's gallery dealer comes by his studio, and he looks at the big oils, and he says, I'm not so interested in those. And he says, what's that over there? And he looks at these projections. He said, that's your next show. And so Bearden sets to work to continue to create these images. And he says, once he started putting the images down, they flooded him. They flooded him from his memory. They flooded him from what he was seeing day to day. They flooded him from the images of the civil rights movement. He said they just came, he says, almost as if he couldn't stop them. He said, almost without beckoning them. And this is what they look like all together in a show. So it's really, to be in a room of these projections is to be into something very powerful. And one of the most remarkable things, I think, about these images is that typically when we look at a painting, it's as if, you know, the figures we're looking and the figures don't know we're looking. But in this case, what he did is he turned the perspective around and he made the images in his paintings look at us, almost as if they were in the middle of a play and they stopped and turned and looked into the audience. And so there was this quality of immediacy, of engagement. He used expressive modes that he would continue to use for the rest of his life, that is slicing these images up to give a sense of fragmentation, to give a sense of the accumulation and complexity of our cultural identities. And you know that these are all Black women, but you can see aspects of other cultures, other images that are woven into this, into the picture plane. I love the fact that the face all the way on the left is partially composed of a Benin mask. I love the small detail of the syrup can, the fragments of newspaper with the white Jesus up top, the image of the train that's going to appear over and over again, symbols start coming back into his life. These were powerful works. From that point on, Bearden continued to make his work representations of African American people, African American culture, and the cultural collisions that go into our identity. And from that point on, from 1964 until his death in 1988, collage and that medium and the representation of our culture became what his work was about. And he put that work, I hate to use the word to use, but in fact, it was put to use. It became incredibly symbolic and potent, and you'll see that in the exhibition as his work became more widely known. In his work, he did not hesitate to critique the United States. You look at the figures in the upper right-hand corner, that's supposed to be him and Mr. Morrie looking down. Mr. Morrie actually had a rooftop terrace, and he and Bearden used to go up and look from his rooftop. But here you have the image of the Statue of Liberty, the American flag, a raised fist. You have allusions to a colonial era. You have remarkably a plane flying into a building. This is 1964. But what he was seeing in this country was, and he uses this term, the imminent collapse of Western civilization. And so in his early collages, he was extremely critical of the direction that he thought the country was heading. And again, if you look at the exhibition, you can see the ways in which major publications began to seize on his work. There's a magazine cover of Fortune magazine. Here's Time magazine with the mayor of New York City, John Lindsay, while the city is collapsing all around him. And in fact, 10 years after this image was done, New York City was on the verge of bankruptcy. So it's amazing how prescient he was also as an artist. As time went on, however, his images began to mellow. He certainly continued with urban themes. This is from a very large piece that's 18 feet long. It's a large, he did many sort of multi-panel themes on the city and on urban life. Collaborations, he began to collaborate intensely with many artists. This is a collaboration he did with Diane McIntyre, a choreographer. He has collaborated with Ntozake Shange, with Derek Walcott, the Nobel Prize-winning poet. He's collaborated with musicians, artists, and his work began to get much more richly colorful. He stopped the practice of photographing the collages and blowing them up, and turn to color. Color becomes very rich, the textures. And these next few images really are examples of some of his mature work. You'll see some of the prints that are also in the exhibition. He goes back, he goes to his memory and recreates those scenes from the nightclubs and the cabarets. He draws from folklore. The Conjure Woman becomes a familiar figure for him. There's her snake in her hand. She could do all kinds of magical things. He still comes back to classical themes, and the Odyssey was a theme that really captured his imagination, this notion of voyaging, of going home, of returning home, and the obstacles and detours and challenges of going home. And in fact, I always felt that his representation of the Odyssey was a kind of autobiographical statement. Here is Circe from the Odyssey. And in fact, shortly after he did the Odyssey, he actually did do an autobiographical series. So the next few paintings collages that you are looking at are from his autobiographical series. But his memory of things that were everyday life are translated into these beautiful tapestries of light and color to get us to see the richness and beauty of the life that around which he grew up. Here's another image from the autobiographical series of women working in the fields. And all of these paintings that accompanied the collages. This is an image of a funeral from his time in Pittsburgh of a young man who was his close friend who passed away. A brothel. The young man who was his friend, his mother lived in a brothel, and this is where he grew up, and he represents that. And finally, the final image of this autobiographical series is a representation of Johnny Hudgens, who performed in blackface at the Lafayette, and performed in blackface in a way that made fun of the practice of performing in blackface. And his going back to the Lafayette, finally, towards the end of Bearden's life, he totally absorbs all of the things that he lived when during the 1930s and the 1940s. His one self-portrait is part of his autobiographical series. This is at the High Museum. There is, by the way, if you're in Atlanta, a show of his autobiographical series at the High. And this is a kind of summing up of his life. Here he has, on the easel, he has those two women, you saw them earlier from the 1940s, the two women in the courtyard, and it's as if he is saying, I draw my inspiration not only from outside, but from my conversation with my artwork itself. Here he alludes to his use of African antiquity. At his elbow is a reproduction of a Renaissance painting, and the model standing in front of him is a reference to his work with the live model. And what he's really saying is that I take my influences from everywhere. To be a black artist is not to be confined and not to be narrow. It's actually to be expansive. We're capacious. We can hold many different cultures all at the same time. And finally, my own person, that's me with hair. When my faculty member showed me the work of Romare Bearden, I went to New York, I saw the show, I thought, boy, it's really great. And I wanted to see more of his work, so I went to the museums all over New York City. Went to the Guggenheim, the Whitney, the Jewish Museum, Metropolitan Museum. I could not find a single piece of work by him. This is in the 1970s, nothing. So there's a public phone. Those of us who are old enough to remember used to have pay phones, right? And payphone had a directory with a chain on it. So my husband said, why don't you just look up his number? So we opened the phone book, and he was in the phone book. So I called him, I said, Mr. Bearden, you don't know me, but I'd like to come and see some of your artwork. I can't find any at any museums. I saw the show, but I can't find any more. And he said, yeah, sure. And I can't imagine that. Can you imagine if somebody calls you and said, I can't imagine that. But we went, and my husband and I spent a couple of hours in his studio, and he laid out his collages and showed me his watercolors and all of that. And that began my a conversation with him that lasted really up until the time that he died. You'll see in the book there are letters that are reproduced that the letters are from him. But he ended up being pivotal to my career because years after I met him, he called me in Syracuse while I was writing my dissertation and said, you know, the Studio Museum in Harlem is looking for a director, and I think you should put your hat in the ring. And so that's how I came to New York. So he was also not only a great artist, not only a social activist, he lobbied for black artists, for black institutions, for black people all the time. When he became famous, he used his celebrity to support artists, curators, scholars, researchers, collectors. He did everything he possibly could. He wrote books about black art. If artists were protesting, he'd be out there on the streets with him. He was really an extraordinary model for how someone spends his life finding who he is, and when he finds who he is, helping others do the same. So it was a joy to write this book and a real honor to be the recipient of the Hooks Award. Thank you.